Welcome back, boils and ghouls. Don't worry, you're not lost, you're just off the beaten rack. A few years back, I did a rough video about Scud the Disposable Assassin, but it's been bothering me a lot lately. Few other series from the 1990s managed to engender such a loyal and lasting fanbase or legacy as Scud. Enigmatic industry outsider and all-around mad genius, Rob Schrab designed Scud to be the antithesis of everything else on the stands at the time. Born from heartbreak and a desire to be seen and heard by the world, Schrab was unfortunately never as taken by the medium as many people perhaps would assume, given his choice to self-publish. In fact, this waning interest in the title, teamed with some disappointing missed opportunities and the near-complete implosion of Schrab's personal life and sanity, brought one of the most fan-beloved titles of the last 30 years to an abrupt end, leaving the titular lead character lingering in a cliffhanger rivaled perhaps only by Ben Edlund's Tick. Thankfully, unlike Edlund and The Tick, a decade after the series prematurely ended in 1998, the series did finally see a happy ending, and Rob Schrab returned to the series for a finality that literally no one, not even Schrab himself, ever saw coming. Join me tonight as we delve into the origins of one of the best kept secrets in comics, and we throw the creator, Firemen Press, Scud the Disposable Assassin, and so much more under the microscope for another insatiably deep dive into some sweet 90s nostalgia. So let us start our tale, a tasty tidbit of tawdry industry trivia, and a little video essay I like to call This Comic Will Self-Destruct, the story of Scud the Disposable Assassin. Remember, if you enjoy these videos, do me a favor, hit that like button. Think about getting in the comment section below and letting me know. If you really like what you see, make sure you Hulk smash that subscribe button. If you feel like you're in a position to help the channel grow, think about signing up for my Patreon page to help me continue creating videos. For as little as $3 a month, you get access to behind the scenes posts, exclusive content, and you can even get your name in the credits. You can also just tip the channel or make one-time donations using the Ko-Fi link in the description below, or sign up for memberships right here on YouTube. And if that's not enough, you can even pick up your very own JerkComic shirts like the ones you see on the screen. But now, let's get into it. Scud was gaining in popularity. There were 2 spin-offs coming out of the series, and it was announced that Scud would still be continuing bi-monthly, with Schrab tackling art duties on all 3 books, as well as writing 2 of them. It was inhuman, and if this sounds completely unfeasible and more than a little impossible, that's because in reality, it was. Schrab couldn't even manage to handle all of the writing, art duties, meetings, and other business operations that were required to run the company, while Scud was the only book they were putting out. Given all of this, you might wonder why they would make such a move to expand, especially with Schrab finding himself increasingly incapable of being everywhere and doing everything himself. Well, I think the truth is, again, the money just wasn't there. Schrab, Harmon, Alberts, and presumably Monty Carter were struggling to make a living off of the title, and more than 2 years into their self-publishing endeavor, with no movie deal and sales at a standstill, times were getting tough. And they hadn't been very easy when they started, so this is saying something. This is also despite the fact that Scud was regularly being featured in the most prominent comic news media of the day. It seems that they hoped by expanding their operation, they would be able to bring in enough money to start making the insanely long hours they were pulling worth it. By this time in 1996, Schrab has said he had been drawing basically 10 to 12 hours a day, 7 days a week for almost 2 years. In the past, Schrab had simply sucked it up and did what he had to do, but when they added the extra books to his workload, despite agreeing to it, he simply could not handle it. Before the year was out, Schrab had entered therapy for crippling anxiety and depression, which made his earlier struggles, the ones which had led him to start the book, seem like a walk in the park. The young artist was at a breaking point and was soon prescribed Prozac to help him combat the depression and severe anxiety his new lifestyle was incurring. While Schrab has obviously never spoken at extreme lengths about this, his counseling, or his being medicated, he has repeatedly brought it up in interviews. One of the things I like and respect most about Rob Schrab is his ability to speak his mind. He's pretty much an open book on any subject you'd care to ask him about, as long as you're respectful and provided he's in the mood to actually answer. Because of this, while details about this part of his life are a little bit iffy, if you do enough digging, you can start to put together a pretty good picture of what was going on behind the scenes with Scud and with his life in general during this period as well. The picture that begins to emerge is not a pleasant one. Schrab was dealing with more than he could, both mentally and physically. While he has said that his art was suffering because he had to rush it at some points prior to this, because of the severity of what was going on and the dosage of medication he was given, apparently the Prozac started to affect his work to the point that he isn't proud of and doesn't even like his work from that period. Schrab points out La Cosa Nostroid as the weakest of his work, explaining, quote, "I was on Prozac when I drew that, so I'm not a big fan of La Cosa Nostroid's line work." Although he didn't make the same comments about Drywall Unzipped, it's clear that not only was he unhappy with his work during this time, but it was simply too much for Rob Schrab. Years later, Schrab would recall, quote, "I remember one year I did Scud Drywall and La Cosa Nostroid all at the same time, and it put me in therapy. I was totally a mess." It literally put you in therapy? Literally. Yeah. They certainly didn't help, but it turns out this probably wasn't due solely to having to work on the added titles either. On top of writing and drawing Scud, La Cosa Nostroid, and Drywall Unzipped, Schrab had also been forced to start taking on random odd writing jobs to try and make ends meet, which he was doing in his, quote, free time. And on top of all of this, he and Dan Harmon had begun working on some rough scripts as well. With a growing number of responsibilities as 1996 came to a close, Schrab was at a breaking point. As if all of this wasn't enough, to make matters worse, the deal with Oliver Stone's Etlon Films went through. I know that might sound strange, but Schrab made the absolutely disastrous decision following this to relocate Firemen Press and all its employees from Milwaukee, where they had been located since their inception, to Los Angeles. This was done in an effort to ensure that he and Dan Harmon would be available and close at hand to work on the Scud movie with Stone and Etlon. They got a house together and used it as a base of operations so they could also still keep Firemen Press up and going, presumably partly to pay the bills, but mostly to continue to bolster interest in getting the movie produced now that it had finally been optioned. If he was stressed, overworked, and in a precarious mental state prior to the move to LA, relocating did little to help, and what followed would seal the fate of Scud the Disposable Assassin for nearly a decade in many ways. Despite having made the move to Los Angeles to be involved and help with the movie, apparently no one at Etlon had told them to do anything of the sort. When they first showed up at the Etlon Productions offices following the move, Schrab has said that the company was confused as to why they were even there. When Schrab explained their film had been optioned, they'd moved to LA to help with the film and write the script, he was told outright that he and Harmon were, quote, just comic book guys, and they would not be writing the script. They hired writers to adapt material, not, well, whatever Schrab and Harmon were. According to Rob Schrab, Etlon instead hired the, quote, Halloween 4 guy. Considering there are no less than 3 people credited with that absolute train wreck of a film, and I know there were a host of other people involved at various stages in that script because I'm a massive Halloween fan, I can't tell you exactly who the, quote, Halloween 4 guy was, though. It certainly wasn't Rob Schrab or Dan Harmon, though, that's for sure. Schrab did like the work that one guy, Teddy Tenenbaum, had done for one of the proposed scripts and began vying for him to take over writing duties, however. What would follow, I think, is kind of a tug-of-war between Schrab, who refused to compromise about the quality and the integrity of his vision with Etlon and Stone, who I don't think really got Schrab's vision for the character or the series. Things were not going well with the film, and with the bills continuing to pile up, the cost of the new home that Firemen Press were using as a headquarters for their operations constantly looming over his head, his own struggles with mental health issues, and the once coveted movie deal having gone sour in Schrab's description. It took less than 3 months for the carefully constructed world it had taken Rob Schrab the better part of 2 years to build to come completely crashing down around his ears. And to make matters worse, things were reaching a breaking point with Scud the Disposable Assassin as a result of all this. One of the more genius things about Scud's construction was the setup. The premise was so wonderfully simple that it allowed Schrab to initially tell any number of one-and-done stories. By having Jeff perpetually in need of money and care, Schrab was able to follow a simple method which didn't require an inordinate amount of thought when writing. This not only allowed Schrab to skirt some difficulties he faced in the beginning when writing the series, but harkened back to his love of cheap action films and low-budget monster affairs. Quote, every month he's got to kill a target to keep his primary target alive. It was basically my way to go, how can I have a robot fight a monster once a month? That was my formula. This had served the series well in the beginning, with Schrab's somewhat limited storytelling experience and relative naivety when it came to some of the finer aspects of narrative storytelling as a result. Over the years, though, the simplistic approach underwent something of a steady change at a certain point. As the art and storytelling became more refined, so did the story. As Schrab became more and more of himself on the title, and with Scud being his surrogate, as Schrab's life changed, so did Scud's, and sometimes the entire tone of the book. No longer a mindless action affair, Scud had begun to meddle in the affairs of the heart in May of 1996, having Scud meet and fall in love with a woman Susudio introduced in issue 12. Given how much of his life seems to have found its way into Scud in various forms, unsurprisingly, Schrab had himself become romantically involved with someone during this period who helped mend his still somewhat sore heart. Sometime in late 97 or early 1998, however, Schrab and this girl broke up. Following this, the tone and direction of Scud shifted dramatically. It wasn't hard to read the writing on the wall if you were paying attention. This was it. Rob Schrab was done, even if he hadn't said it yet, and that would be coming soon enough. After nearly 5 years of hard work and sleepless nights, he felt like he virtually had nothing to show for it. No movie, no girl, and with the bills continuing to pile up, no money to even publish the book. As I said before, as Schrab describes it, drawing a comic is one of the most lonely and stressful experiences that one can undertake. While I talked a little bit about why I think this is before, because of the assumed less than positive interactions he'd had with fans, as well as his increasing seclusion from anyone that was a fan and read the book, albeit by his own design as a result of the aforementioned, Schrab had begun to see comics as a kind of prison he was being forced to live within the confines of. They no longer presented vast fields of freedom and untapped potential. The grids on his page had become the bars that locked him in his home and chained him to his drawing table. Schrab described his experience working on the book as the following, quote, it's like a 12-hour-a-day job. You're isolated with nothing but your own self-hatred to keep you company. 5% of your brain is working on the comic, and the rest of your brain is going, why did you do that? It's totally picking apart and analyzing everything, so you're basically sitting in a room doing nothing other than drawing, so it's pretty exhausting sometimes. And even though Scud's numbers were really good for the black and white genre, out here in Los Angeles, it wasn't paying enough for me to survive off of. Schrab explained that the mounting troubles were indeed almost all stemming from money, and that he was facing increased difficulty simply making ends meet on a monthly basis following the relocation to LA. Quote, Dan was working for me at the time, and we had to pay him. Every time we paid him, it was taking more money away from us, so everybody was slowly becoming more and more poor. It was a vicious cycle. The book wasn't making enough money, so Schrab would invest more time and effort into it, while this in turn simply helped to sour him further on his own creation and made that work all the more difficult and laborious. By 1997, Firemen Press simply couldn't bring in enough money to pay for the house where the four men were now living in LA, which also doubled as their company headquarters. The Scud deal, which they seemed to have hung their hat on, had been an utter disappointment, and to top it all off, Schrab was starting to dislike his own comic book more and more with each passing day. And I'm not talking about an understandable and healthy discontentment with something that you're forced to spend this long working on regularly. I mean, Schrab was starting to hate Scud the Disposable Assassin. He summed up his feelings years later pretty succinctly saying, quote, "After 5 years of doing nothing but drawing for 12 hours a day, every day, I was sick of it. I remember telling the Firemen Press business manager, you know something? I hate comics. I always have. You know which book I hate the most? Mine." Despite the movie deal being an abject fail, there were some final hopes held out by several people involved with Firemen Press when they managed to get another deal signed, this time for a video game. While the game industry certainly wasn't what it is today, there's no doubt that a smash hit video game could land you some seriously profitable deals even then. Sadly, this was not to be the case, and when it came out, the first Scud game released on the Sega Saturn in February of 1997 did not do what they had hoped. The reviews were mixed, though I think Scud was kind of unfairly ignored and maligned for reasons I'm not entirely able to ascertain given my complete lack of knowledge when it comes to the video game industry and how things work. At the time, a lot of people familiar with the source material were seriously impressed with the graphics, overall design, and just how closely it actually resembled the comic book, which was a rare thing in those days. Critics, however, universally agreed that despite the fact there was no less than 3 different modes in which to play the game, it was repetitive and boring, although I'm unsure exactly how that works. Unfortunately, I've never had the chance to play it, as I definitely didn't have the money for the game, let alone a Sega Saturn at the time, so I can't say for sure. I do find this a little hard to swallow, considering one of the most interesting elements of the game is that it can be played as either a run-and-gun shooter with a controller or with up to 2 light guns. They went so far as to actually enable the usage of the 2 light guns simultaneously because Scud was basically always seen carrying dual pistols in his most iconic images. Despite praise for the design of the game and a lot of people rather enjoying the animation and graphics, not only was the game universally ignored and rather promptly forgotten, but there was a second video game, Industrial Evolution, released by Sega Soft for Windows that same year in 1997, which also disastrously underperformed. Whereas the first Scud game had some decent coverage at the time, as well as even today with retro game reviews and stuff, from what I saw, it looks to be a top-down shooter and garnered even less critical and fan attention than the original Sega Saturn release did, and for good reason. The gameplay I was able to find looks nauseatingly annoying and difficult to control. Had they held off or at least done something interesting or unique with the second game, there might have been some hope for the series to have carried on, even if Rob Schrab had decided to leave or put it on hold for a while. In Schrab's eyes, following the failure of the second game, especially though, and with everything else that was going on, I think this was a sign to Schrab that perhaps it was time for an agonizing reappraisal of the situation. In January of 1998, with issue 18 on the shelves, having spent the last 5 years in basic seclusion and having to put much of the rest of his life on hold to make the comic happen, Schrab made a fateful decision. He was going to end Scud the Disposable Assassin. The movie deal with Stone renewed 3 times, and Schrab began personally holding it up after the removal of Teddy Tenenbaum, the screenwriter he wanted on the project, was fired. Obviously, that wasn't going to pan out like he wanted. He was depressed. The comic was eating up all of his time, and they weren't even really making any money at it. As I said, to pay the bills, Harmon and Schrab had begun picking up small writing assignments and different jobs and fitting them into their hectic schedules where they could. The thing was, though, those jobs ended up paying much better than working on Scud ever did, and Schrab began to become increasingly distraught about having to continue the book, quote, "Even though Scud's numbers were really good for the black and white genre, out here in Los Angeles, it wasn't paying enough for me to survive off of. And when we were getting these writing jobs and making the best money I've ever had, I was like, well, I've always wanted to get into movies. My goal with Scud was to get into movies, so now that movies are here, I'm not going to screw up my chance to get in. Let Scud go." With this in mind and a clear definitive end to Scud in sight, during the end of 1997, after receiving the official kiss-off from Stone and Edlund, Harmon and Schrab hunkered down and in whatever spare time they could manage, completed their first real script, a spec script which they affectionately dubbed BAM, or Big Ant Movie. Despite never seeing production, the script would breathe an entirely new life into Schrab's film career and take him to places he'd only dreamed of before. Sadly, it would also ultimately prove to be the final nail in the coffin for Firemen Press Limited and Scud the Disposable Assassin, ending the title once and for all. Or so it seemed at the time. Scud was selling about 3,000 or 4,000 copies an issue, nothing to scoff at when it comes to an independent black and white self-published book about a robotic assassin. When the video games flopped, Schrab's girlfriend broke up with him and the Oliver Stone deal went horribly wrong. Schrab had driven himself almost mad by trying to single-handedly expand the roster of titles though. Following this, as he attempted to mentally recover during 1998 in one last-ditch effort to rescue the imprint, even if Schrab was going to be ending Scud, Firemen Press announced Tales from the Vending Machine. Tales from the Vending Machine would feature a rotating cast of writers and artists that Schrab apparently handpicked and would also be published bi-monthly like Scud was. I think the initial hope was that bringing in some outside talent from other books and releasing comics from other creators would net the profit they needed to legitimize keeping the operation going without putting any more undue pressure on Rob Schrab, who at this point was basically done with comic books. Given the level of his own disinterest at the time, and the fact that Rob Schrab was the main mouthpiece for Firemen Press, who came up with this idea and exactly how they hit on it is a little bit of a mystery though. It seems that it would kind of be a logical step for someone like Peter Alberts, that is if he was indeed the one handling the business affairs of Firemen Press. If this is true, which by all accounts it is, Alberts would have shared in the profits and therefore had a vested interest in keeping the company going, as well as presumably more time and energy to devote to this type of task than the disenfranchised Schrab, who seems to have been totally cool with just kind of packing up his bags and walking away from the industry at this point. This, however, is only a bit of supposition on my part, as so much of Firemen Press's history remains clouded in uncertainty, simply because I don't think it's ever actually been documented anywhere. At least not that I'm aware of. Now, while Tales from the Vending Machine would last a paltry 5 issues, and isn't even necessarily remembered by a lot of fans at this point, it was an important series for a few reasons, if not for Scud, then for Schrab and the dramatic shift his career would be taking very shortly. The first issue of Tales from the Vending Machine was done by indie comic wonderkind Trent Kanuga of Creed fame, another guy who I actually really want to do a series on as well, but have run into the same kind of problems I had working on this documentary. Having created his own comic company, Hall of Heroes, who were the original publishers of Creed only a few years prior when he was still only a teenager, Kanuga was an interesting and worthy person to take up duties on the first issue of Tales from the Vending Machine. The thought was that this would not only bring in readers from outside of Scud following said writers and artists, but it would also allow Firemen Press to keep the presses going without Rob Schrab having to actually write or draw anything if he didn't want to. While it's my best guess that the idea for a spin-off series was Peter Alberts, Rob Schrab came up with the premise. While he was happy for other people to come in and play in the Scud universe and feel free to do what they wanted, his character wouldn't be a part of it. Schrab ingeniously came up with the idea of each issue being a self-contained one-shot story that told the story of a Scud unit purchased from a vending machine, carrying out their mission, and then self-destructing at the end, thus the name Tales from the Vending Machine. Schrab later explained this was basically his way of giving people the template of the first issue and seeing what they did with it, or as the write-up on the inside of the first issue of Tales from the Vending Machine states, Tales from the Vending Machine is creator Rob Schrab's way of bringing back the magic of Scud number 1. I don't necessarily think the series succeeded on that front for a host of reasons, but the premise and talent for the series was definitely solid. While not every issue succeeded, other artists on the short-lived series include some really important names in Rob Schrab and Scud's lives, like Ruben Martinez, Jim Mahfood, Jorge Pacheco, and Doug TenNapel. Both Jim Mahfood and Doug TenNapel would either become or were already close friends with Rob Schrab and would continue to play an important part in his life as we move forward. Ruben Martinez, on the other hand, had ended up working for Firemen Press through an absolute fluke, and a rather interesting one if I do say so myself. So if you don't mind, this story is just too good not to share. One of the few people that Rob Schrab ever handpicked to work on one of his series didn't even read Scud when he first became involved with Firemen Press. Martinez had a buddy who is a huge Scud fan, and as a favor to him, Martinez did an absolutely ridiculous pinup illustration. He might not have been a big Scud fan, but Martinez knew that his buddy liked it and was pretty proud of the illustration from what I understand. When Martinez later ran into Dan Harmon at a convention not long after this, who was described at this point as a, quote, Firemen Press editor, I might add, Martinez gave him the illustration thinking he might get a kick out of it. Apparently, while all of this was going on, Wizard magazine was also holding a Scud drawing competition, though unfortunately my catalog of Wizard is woefully incomplete and I sadly couldn't tell you the exact issue. I do know Scud had been featured as one of Palmer's picks as far back as issue 44 in April of 1995, and Schrab had at least one spotlight article published in issue 60, cover dated August 1996. Wizard retooled their magazine and dropped the drawing board section after briefly attempting to give it a sort of cohesive theme a few times with issue 63. I don't know if the Draw Scud competition was part of one of the themed drawing boards or if it ran prior to this, but after issue 63 in November of 1996, Wizard rarely ran fan art. Regardless of when the competition was or what issue of Wizard the competition was in, what's important is that Rob Schrab selected Martinez's pinup as the winner and Wizard subsequently ran it. This is all despite the fact that Martinez never submitted the illustration to the contest. Apparently, when Martinez had given a copy of the illustration to Dan Harmon at the convention, Harmon had been so impressed with it that he'd entered it in the Wizard competition, which there happened to be a convention entry drop-off at the same convention for Martinez. Following its publication in Wizard, Martinez's illustration also ended up running as the back cover to issue 15 of Scud in May of 1997 as well. The complete antithesis of Schrab's style, Martinez's work is absolutely berserk, and apparently so is the fan reaction to the piece. Due to fan requests, Martinez was asked to contribute pinups for both La Cosa Nostroid issues 3 and 4 not long after, and when Tales from the Vending Machine kicked off, apparently Rob Schrab personally tracked Martinez down and asked him if he wanted to do an issue of the series. Martinez signed on, and while Firemen Press was not long for this world, if they had stuck around, I have little doubt that you would have been seeing a lot more of Chris Martinez. See, I told you, pretty cool, right? I'm not sure how they originally met, but Jim Mahfood, another of the talents recruited for work on the series, is one of the few names, along with Doug TenNapel and Dan Harmon, that seems to always pop up when discussing Schrab, and more specifically, his comic book work. While Mahfood and Schrab would collaborate a few times, with Mahfood having a few stories printed, as well as Schrab airing some of his experimental film work on his channel 101, they never did much else of note that has to do with Our Tale Tonight. I will say that one of the best Rob Schrab interviews ever conducted was by Jim Mahfood, and I got a lot of great information from that piece. We owe Mahfood a debt of gratitude for getting some of that stuff on the record, given how tight-lipped Rob Schrab has proven to be when it comes to details about certain aspects of Scud and his comic book career in general. Jim Mahfood was a good friend, but Doug TenNapel seems to have not only been an important person in Schrab's life, but a longtime champion of his work as well. I wasn't able to learn how the two met. The closest I got was a passing mention of, quote, becoming friends with the three renegade gentlemen of the comics industry under the name of Firemen Press, which appeared in the Gear reprint trade paperback by Image, which I seriously want to thank channel viewer Reckoning for sending me a copy of so I could finish this piece up, by the way. I seriously appreciate it. As far as Doug TenNapel, while I might not agree with his politics, there's no denying that he's an extremely extremely gifted writer and artist. His bitingly original designs and illustration really are amazing, even if I can't financially back him anymore, unfortunately. While he only did a single issue of Tales from the Vending Machine for Schrab and Firemen Press at some point in 1998, which I was unable to ascertain the publication date due to the fact that not only were most people not keeping track by this point, it wasn't listed in the indicia or publication information for some reason. TenNapel appears to have not only been an important person in Schrab's life, but an important part of what would have been Firemen Press moving forward had they ultimately not closed their doors shortly after this. While Tales from the Vending Machine is relatively unknown and largely ignored, La Cosa Nostroid, which ended on an unfinished cliffhanger with issue 9 as well in May of 1998, was written by Dan Harmon and has a decent cult following. Many fans seek out La Cosa Nostroid to complete their Scud collections, as it did spin directly out of the pages of Scud, featuring a supporting cast member from the book, mobster Tony Tasty. While savvy fans have read La Cosa Nostroid, one book I don't think a lot of people remember at all for a few reasons is Big Crap Scare from the tail end of 1997. An outlier for sure, featuring absolutely no Scud material, or in fact drawings by Schrab at all, Big Crap Scare is likely another good look into where Firemen Press would have gone had they managed to stick around. The Halloween-themed one-shot features short stories by Firemen Press regulars Monty Carter, Ruben Martinez, Edviz, as well as Jim Mahfood and Tony Elwood did these crazy 3D rendered models for the Rob Schrab story Crazy Train. While a totally solid affair, Big Crap Scare feels like Rob Schrab was trying to keep his name attached to a book and a toe in the comic world while not having to actually draw himself, as he became less involved with the comic industry as a whole and more involved with various writing projects for film and TV instead. While La Cosa Nostroid and Big Crap Scare give a fair idea of where Firemen Press might have gone, most people think this is where the story for the publisher ends. They couldn't be more wrong, in my opinion. There's another book that Firemen Press released, one I've mentioned in passing a few times actually, but one virtually no one remembers that they even released. A book, I believe, which typifies what Firemen Press was all about to begin with, typifies almost everything that Rob Schrab actually enjoys about comic books and offers the most telling glimpse into what could have been for the publisher. Gear. Almost entirely forgotten at times, sadly, Gear is not only the last thing that Firemen Press Limited released, but it was also an extremely important book for both Rob Schrab and writer-artist Doug TenNapel, for both of whom the book would have long-standing impacts on their careers. I know La Cosa Nostroid abruptly ceased publication in May of 1998. I don't know exactly when Tales from the Vending Machine ended, but it started in February of that year, so as a bi-monthly publication, it would have wrapped sometime around October of 1998. Scud had also sadly ceased its run mid-story in April of that same year. This is all important because Doug TenNapel's absolutely incredible Gear didn't start publication until November of 1998. Even more interesting is the fact that it ran 6 issues and didn't wrap up publication until April of 1999. This means that Gear is nearly a year out from what many people think are Firemen Press's last books. While this is sadly telling when it comes to reminiscing about why the company didn't manage to stick around, especially given how good Gear is, it also illustrates how heavily invested in this series Rob Schrab had to have been to continue publication with it almost 6 months after basically closing down Firemen Press Limited for all intents and purposes. By April of the year prior, he had given up work on Scud and was continuously making moves away from the industry, not getting more involved. This means Gear had to have been something special to get him to stick around, as well as to convince Peter Alberts it was worth hanging what was left of Firemen Press on at this point. Gear is an impressive work all its own, but it also appears to share some rather interesting parallels with Schrab's Scud the Disposable Assassin completely by chance. Doug TenNapel's career kind of worked in the direct opposite of Schrab's, though. Schrab was trying to get into media, but by 1998, Doug TenNapel was longing for an escape from film and video games into comics. Doug TenNapel had written and drawn his first work that I know of nearly 7 years prior, releasing a 9-page black and white comic They called him evil way back in 1991. That same year, TenNapel had begun working on the Attack of the Killer Tomatoes cartoon show and was quickly forced to abandon the medium as he managed to parlay Attack of the Killer Tomatoes into working on video games, including Jurassic Park, Ren and Stimpy's Invention, and The Jungle Book throughout 1992 and 1993. In 1994, Doug TenNapel created the character which he's undoubtedly most synonymous with, Earthworm Jim, for the wildly successful video game of the same name. While he developed the first Earthworm Jim game with Shiny Entertainment, and they quickly followed the original up with an almost as equally well-received sequel only a year later in 1995, TenNapel soon parted ways with Shiny Entertainment. He struck out on his own, creating Neverhood Incorporated in the process. Neverhood produced a few games between 1995 and 1998, but it was around this time that Doug TenNapel decided to have a real go at comics. The only problem was, he didn't really know anyone in the industry. Totally by chance, it seems this is when Doug TenNapel met Rob Schrab and the other, quote, renegades from Firemen Press, and the two just kind of hit it off. Doug TenNapel had inexplicably been completely left out of the Earthworm Jim comics that Marvel had produced between 1994 and 1995, and given that his first work in the industry, albeit a short, had been a comic about Evil the Cat, this might have had something to do with his renewed interest in the medium, though I can't say this with any level of certainty. Regardless of the whys, Gear would not only be the last book that Schrab released under the Firemen Press Limited banner, but perhaps one of the best independent books of its day, absolutely on par with Scud in every regard in my opinion, which is definitely saying something for me. Gear is a totally off-the-wall story about warring factions of anthropomorphic animals, specifically centered around a group of 3 cats. These towns are basically all segregated by species, and they live in these fortified settlements with their only defense being these big, giant robots. The title of the series comes from a mythical gear, which will turn whatever robot that it's installed in into an unstoppable juggernaut. I know, I wonder why Rob Schrab was so intent on putting this one out. While it was published in black and white, Gear didn't even vestigially resemble Scud or any of Firemen Press's other books, though. The art was absolutely stellar, with TenNapel's brushwork absolutely singing on the page, and the story was a wonderful example of an all-ages story told in the same vein as many of those kids' movies from the 80s Schrab was so influenced by himself. It's really incredible to see, but unfortunately, if you think some of the Scud issues get a little pricey, try picking up a complete minty run of Gear. The reason that Gear is so expensive is pretty interesting, and I swear it's integral to our tale tonight, so indulge me here for a moment. The series was a long-time favorite of Doug TenNapel's fans, but it didn't really catch on with readers in a big way until it was re-released by Image Comics almost a decade later after it ceased publication in 2007. This collection was done because Gear had inspired an animated adaptation for Nickelodeon 3 years prior in 2005, which had been retitled Cat Scratch, which I'll talk about just a little bit here in a second. When Image re-released Gear, it was noticeably different, however, having been completely colored while the original run was entirely in black and white, like all of Firemen Press's other books. Gear still looks good, but TenNapel had used a brush to ink the entire original series. Looking at his ink work on those original black and white pages is not only absolutely incredible, but make it well worth the hefty price that this series can command on the secondhand market today. Gear was actually the first work that Doug TenNapel ever did with a horsehair brush, and you can kind of see him learning and developing from page to page, issue to issue. It's a minimalist exercise in independent comics with a heavy dose of artistic experimentation as far as style and design goes. All things which Schrab not only loved in comics, but would obviously have been seeking in anyone that Firemen Press might hire or recruit. There's a gritty, dirty feel to the original black and white version of Gear. You can see the brushstrokes and the raw energy of TenNapel's work on every page. This is almost the exact definition of the type of comic book that Rob Schrab loves, which is a small section of the medium, to be generous. Interestingly enough, Gear would have long-standing consequences in not only Doug TenNapel and Rob Schrab's worlds, but would also help to completely redefine Matt Groening's Bongo comics as well. Just one example of the love that it gets and the doors that the series has opened for him over the years, when an editor on The Simpsons comics, Terry Delagene, happened to see an issue of Gear, Doug TenNapel got his first real job in the industry after being invited to work on issue 5 of Bart Simpson's Treehouse of Horror series. This issue, and actually this story, Apu on Rigel 7, were the pivotal turning points for one of the best comic series I have ever read. And yes, I just said that about a Simpsons comic. If you want to learn more about the absolutely incredible Treehouse of Horror series, which is one of the industry's best kept secrets, make sure to check out my multi-part deep dive using the links in the description below. While he was working on Treehouse of Horror, Doug TenNapel took note of how well the colors suited his brushwork, and this is why the Image Comics re-release of Gear is in color apparently, though I still say they should have either included or at least released both versions. Despite it only lasting 6 issues, Gear had never been far from TenNapel's heart or mind for several reasons. As I said, he even went so far as to basically completely retool the book and concept in 2005, nearly 6 years later, for a Nickelodeon cartoon show nonetheless. Yeah, it was super weird. While basically none of the elements of Gear made it into the show, retitled Cat Scratch, they went so far as to specifically name the main character's favorite toy, a monster truck, Gear, as an obvious nod to the original source material. 6 years might sound like a long time, but apparently Doug TenNapel had been working on adapting the series as early as 2001, only a year and some change after the end of the publication of the original Firemen Press run. Working on the Cat Scratch series, as different as it might have been from the source material, led to a continued interest in the series on TenNapel's part, and I think thereby extension, Schrab was never too far from his thoughts either. Despite how wonderful it might have been, and the fact that Gear would go on to inspire an animated adaptation, warrant an Image reprint a decade later, and still has a fairly loyal following to this day, due largely in part to the latter two facts, Gear was far from enough to save Firemen Press, who called it quits immediately following the release of the final issue of the series. Although funnily enough, Gear would ultimately end up saving Scud in a lot of ways, but don't worry, we'll get there soon enough. Back in 1999, though, bills were getting harder and harder to pay. Dan Harmon and Rob Schrab were choosing to put their time and effort into scripts and other writing projects where the paychecks dwarfed anything that they could ever hope to achieve with the comic company, and it seems that all was not well with Firemen Press on several levels. With Schrab increasingly distracted and disinterested in Scud, and comics in general for that matter, along with the failure of the new titles to garner enough capital to warrant Firemen Press's continued existence, the writing was on the wall, and this time there was no missing it. While there had been close calls before, following the publication of the 6th and final issue of Gear in April 1999, Firemen Press ceased to be, as far as I can tell. They never released a comic again, and in the very few interviews where I could even find mention of the company, Schrab alluded to some less than pleasant happenings which were taking place behind the scenes at the time. Schrab has said that he was an absolute train wreck, mentally and physically. He was overworked, underpaid, and fiscally responsible for at least 2, possibly 3 other men and their living quarters, which doubled as their work headquarters. At the same time, Rob Schrab and Dan Harmon were making more money than they had ever dreamed of in the comics industry on various writing projects for random stuff and having fun while doing it. Something Schrab definitely could not say about his work on Scud anymore. I don't know the exact circumstances that led to the dissolution of Firemen Press, but I do know that Schrab's decision to end Scud and move farther away from comics and get more into film and television didn't necessarily make for the smoothest transition for the other business partners in Firemen Press. As Schrab would explicitly state years later, quote, "My personal life was in this and this new career was taking off, and there was a breakup in my company, and there was just so much anger and pain and fear going on in my life." From these comments, while it might not be clear exactly what was wrong, there were obviously behind-the-scenes struggles taking place, most likely stemming from Firemen Press's inability to turn a palatable profit. I normally wouldn't even bother to bring this up, as it's almost invariably going to be the case for any publisher that decides to call it quits. But I discovered while working on this documentary, one of the big reasons that you don't see Scud pop up like you used to, and to be honest, it kind of really surprised me. Apparently, Rob Schrab only owns 50% of Scud. Now, I'm not sure if this refers to the entire title in general or just the titular character, but Schrab said, and I quote, "Scud's kind of tied up. I'm not the only owner of it. I only own 50% of it." While I long suspected something like this, given Scud's suspicious absence from merchandising even after the series ended, Schrab said, quote, "The business person in me says I should do another property which would be solely me." During a 2014 Ask Me Anything interview, Schrab even lamented that there were a, quote, "bunch of rights crap that makes it truly heartbreaking." Again, I was unable to discover whether this refers solely to our Scud 1373 model Heartbreaker unit or the series as a whole, as details about precisely why Firemen Press called it quits, how the company ended, if this rights situation was a possible fallout from this, or if this was all just a deal from day one, are essentially non-existent from what I can tell. While much of these finer details might be kind of in question, given the lack of details out there, I think I can safely say who the other partial owner of Scud is. There are only 3 people that I know of consistently showing up, and more importantly being officially mentioned as part of Firemen Press. Writer Monty Carter, who is one of the other founding members of the Dead Alewives and on-again, off-again writer for Scud, along with Dan Harmon, who is almost certainly a Firemen Press employee as well. The last name officially affiliated, and the one most mentioned in press, is Peter Alberts. While Alberts is simply listed as the, quote, "producer" in all of the official Firemen Press material, Doug TenNapel identified Alberts as the, quote, "publisher" from Firemen Press in the image reprint of Gear, and Alberts is also referred to as a, quote, "business manager" in one of the Wizard articles about Scud. While his positions varied from account to account, producers usually handle the money. Rob Schrab has said in interviews, as I mentioned before, that Alberts handled the, quote, "business" while he handled the art. If Alberts was indeed the publisher, or even just the money man, then this more than likely means he's the guy who has the other half of Scud. Though, as I said, this is simply an educated guess on my part and unfortunately not backed up by any concrete empirical evidence I was able to uncover. This rights situation would also help explain statements that Rob Schrab has repeatedly made in interviews, saying that if you do ever decide to option or license your property, to make sure that you have a time limitation of only a few years set for options and licenses, and never give up more than 40% of your creation. While I'd always thought these were references to his deal with Stone's Etlon Productions, with the fact he only owns half of his own creation, this hints at there being a great deal more tension having to do with Scud than I had originally envisioned. I don't know what the deal with Peter Alberts was or is regarding Scud, but I get the feeling that Schrab is definitely not happy that he doesn't own the character outright today, given his repeated statements about rights and ownership in interviews going forward. While he laments only owning part of the character today, at the time I don't know how much he was interested or invested in necessarily holding on to the character. This may have resulted in Schrab making a less than ideal deal when it came to his hasty exit from the comic market and the closure of Firemen Press Limited. Which brings us to this most unfortunate part of our tale tonight. Now, Schrab had already decided to end Scud while finishing issue 18, but during work for issue 19, he began to come up with the best and quickest way to end the series. He concluded the best course of action would be to finish issue 20, which was already written and partially laid out, and then wrap the series in issue 21 with one final grand tale he would pen in the interim. But you know what they say about the best laid plans of mice and men. Following the release of issue 18, during work on the 19th issue, and after the completion of the Big Ant movie spec script, Schrab finally had a stroke of luck. Hollywood scriptwriter Teddy Tenenbaum, who was competing with the unnamed Halloween 4 scriptwriter to do Scud, had become a big fan of the book while he was working on the script for Stone's Etlon Productions. As it turned out, Tenenbaum was actually interested in getting into comics himself and got in touch with Schrab in hopes he might be able to help him out. With Schrab looking for any way to get books out without having to necessarily work on them and always aware of the power of networking, Schrab made a deal. He agreed to let Tenenbaum take a crack at writing the second issue of Tales from the Vending Machine. In exchange, Tenenbaum would then pass the big Ant movie script out to some higher-up mucky mucks that he knew around town in hopes of sparking some interest. Tenenbaum readily agreed, and despite the fact he wasn't sure anything would really come of Tenenbaum getting the script out, Schrab ran his script for Tales from the Vending Machine in issue 2. I don't honestly think he thought too much more about it after that, though. At the same time, Schrab was busy on issue 20 of Scud and writing an ending for the series to wrap up all those loose ends he'd left dangling over the last 19 issues, so he had a lot on his mind. As time passed and he continued to try and put issue 21 together, Schrab ran into two major problems, though. First, Schrab hated working on the book by this point. He just couldn't hardly sit down and draw anymore. This was a problem as, according to interviews, it took Schrab about 12 hours from start to finish on a page. This means that Rob Schrab had basically been doing a half a page to a page for nearly 5 years with virtually no breaks, and he was done with it at this point. He just couldn't muster the motivation to sit down and draw for another 50 or 60 hours on a book he didn't care about. The second one was that he had recently gone through another breakup, as I had mentioned. And this one was ugly. More than anything else, it seems that this may have been the downfall of Scud in a lot of ways. A guy who seemingly wears his heart on his sleeve. Anyways, Rob Schrab was incredibly bitter following the end of his relationship. He was so bitter that he basically set to sabotaging the entire series a single issue before he planned to end it, whether this was intentional or not. Spoiler alert for a 30-year-old book, but Scud's longtime love interest and one of the more interesting concepts and ideas that developed during the title's run, Susudio, was brutally murdered for what seemed like no real reason story-wise. This is because there really wasn't one. There had been no grand plan, the series hadn't been leading to it, it just kind of happened while Schrab was working on the series. This, however, was due to a very good reason in Schrab's real life. Scud had always been a kind of writer surrogate for Schrab, with him going so far as to say at one point, quote, "Scud is an autobiography." While the end of a relationship had in fact sparked Scud's creation, the book had eventually helped him work his way through that emotional hardship. Now he was back where he'd started in a lot of regards, depressed, lonely, and feeling like he had nowhere left to go. But this time, his personal and professional life were in absolute tatters as well, and Scud was no longer an escape. It instead had begun to increasingly feel more and more like a prison to Schrab. If Schrab had initially managed to deal with the loss of his girlfriend with Scud as a coping mechanism, the exact opposite seems to have been true in this second instance, especially given the contents of this final issue of the Firemen Press run. In interviews over the years, Schrab has said that people were beginning to increasingly complain about the book and its decline in quality, a point which he not only conceded, but heavily agreed with. He says that he was simply too angry, bitter, and disenfranchised with the series to do it any justice by this time. According to Schrab, he'd just been going through the motions for a while, and his personal life had been leaking more and more onto the page, which is true. But to many of us readers, this wasn't necessarily a bad thing. For Schrab, as he grew increasingly angry at the world, it most certainly was, however. This anger was personified in the ending of issue 20, where Susudio is literally hacked to pieces in front of Scud by rebellious angels who have enslaved God and are planning on wiping out humanity by offering Scud a contract to kill the world, saying that without her, Scud has, quote, "no reason to exist." Yeah, I know. It's dark and weird. Well, Scud had been a book which was so positive and funny for so long in a lot of ways that when it began to take a dark and ugly turn, you could kind of tell something was off almost immediately. It just felt weird sometimes. And yes, this was one of those weird moments. Mind you, it wasn't bad, but it was becoming more and more evident that Schrab was going through some stuff. While the absolutely nihilistic ending had already been planned, Schrab's inability to contain the contempt he felt for the work on that series would be the straw that broke the camel's back and finally spelled disaster for our beloved Heartbreaker model, at least for the time being. Schrab had apparently originally planned to end the series with Scud finally stabbing Jeff in the heart and having the entire world explode. But for the life of him, Rob Schrab couldn't bring himself to start working on the actual issue. He had the idea in his head, it was basically written, and Schrab knew what was going to happen. But for the first time in almost 5 years, try as he might, he simply couldn't put pen to paper and make it happen. Scud had long since began to miss its bi-monthly publication schedule, so initially many of us just patiently waited for the next issue, not knowing at the time it was intended to be the last one anyways. In the end, that didn't really matter though, because the bomb never dropped. There was no explosion, and Scud died not with a bang, but with a whimper, as Schrab simply never delivered the final issue. Weeks and then months passed, and there was still no word about Scud. This is when some of us started to worry, as word began to spread that not only the series but the publisher was done as well, and that Schrab wouldn't even be working in comics anymore. In a matter of months, Firemen Press imploded. He completely lost interest in Scud after his long-term relationship came to an extraordinarily painful end, and even prior to all of this, the pressure of his life had become so extreme that Rob Schrab was actually forced to enter therapy and start taking medication to help mitigate the depression and anxiety. Things must have seemed absolutely hopeless to Rob Schrab, who by this point was literally resorting to dismembering his beloved creations in the pages of his self-published, semi-autobiographical comic book. That's when Teddy Tenenbaum delivered life-changing news. News that would change Rob Schrab's life forever. However, while this was great news for Rob Schrab and his Hollywood aspirations, as Scud disappeared from store shelves forever, it would leave fans of the series hanging on a perpetual cliffhanger and with little hope of ever seeing any closure for one of the most popular and fondly remembered independent titles of the 1990s. Thanks so much for sticking with me. I hope you all enjoyed, maybe even learned something. If you did enjoy what you saw, make sure you hit that like button. Think about getting in the comment section below and letting me know. And if you really enjoyed what you saw, make sure you Hulk smash that subscribe button. If you do that, make sure you ding the little notification bell so you never miss another video or premiere again. If you feel like you're in a position to help the channel grow, think about using the link in the description below to sign up for my Patreon page. For as little as $3 a month, you get access to tons of behind-the-scenes posts, updates, exclusive content like uncut interviews, and you can even get your name in the credits. If you want to support the channel but Patreon is not your thing, have no fear. You can finally sign up for membership right here on YouTube. Just hit the little join button and make sure to select the tier and perks that fit you best. If that's not enough, you can also make one-time donations towards specific goals or just tip the channel using the Ko-Fi link in the description below. You can even pick up your very own JerkComic shirts like the ones you see on the screen now. As always, this video was brought to you by the Jerk Broadcasting Service, as well as generous grants from the Patreon, Ko-Fi, and YouTube members you see on the screen now. I seriously want to thank every single one of you that supports the channel and helps make these videos possible. I really hope the quality and content is getting better, and I can't wait to see where this next year takes us with your continued support. Thank you again for helping this crazy dream of mine be a reality and for sticking with me. I hope you all enjoyed, maybe even learned something, and as always, I really, truly, and honestly ask only two things. Keep hitting those local shops and keep reading comics.